CRAM is an acronym for Communicating Research and More, which is what we try to do on this podcast. A lot of exciting research and groundbreaking ideas never reach the public, but they have the potential to change the way we think and act. The first time I heard Adam Kahane speak, I stopped what I was doing. He was being interviewed about 5 years ago, and he was talking about resolving conflict between opposing groups, something he knows a lot about. He's a conflict mediator, and he's been involved in some of the world's most enduring and disruptive conflicts, including South Africa's transition from apartheid, Colombia's civil war, Israel-Palestine, Northern Ireland, and Guatemala after genocide. And I was struck by what he said, that it is possible to collaborate with the enemy, people you really don't like and you don't agree with. And he said this collaboration can happen whether it's war between nations, conflict with organizations, or disputes between family and friends. So I wanted to speak to Adam Kahane since I heard that interview, and I am so pleased that he's here today. He's a director of Rios Partners in Montreal, and he's the author of a number of books, including Collaborating with the Enemy, and his most recent, Facilitating Breakthrough, How to Remove Obstacles, Bridge Differences, and Move Forward Together. Hello, Adam. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Mary. I'm happy to be with you.
Well, I want to start off, first of all, and ask, how did you even get interested in this kind of work?
Well, I fell into this work very much by accident or destiny or whatever it is. My training is completely inappropriate. I went to McGill in theoretical physics and then studied energy and environmental economics at Berkeley. And so all of my training was to be somebody who knew the right answer. And if I fast forward a bit, I went to work for Shell in London in the strategic planning department. And that's when I first got a glimpse that you could help people figure out what to do, not by telling them what they ought to do, but by helping them figure it out by themselves. And during the time I was at Shell in 1991, I was invited to facilitate a group in South Africa, a group that became known as the Montfleur Scenario Team. Montfleur is the name of a conference center outside of Cape Town. And that was a team that remarkably was made up of people from across the whole society: politicians, business people, trade unionists, academics, civil society activists, black and white, opposition and establishment, men and women. I wouldn't claim it was the decisive event in South African history, although I think it made some contribution to the transition from apartheid to democracy, especially in the area of economic policy of the Mandela government. But it was certainly a hinge event in my life. The methodology we used at Montfleur was exactly the same as the one we were using at Shell. But I noticed there was something fundamentally different about the energy of the group, I don't know how to say it, other than that, about the spirit of the group. And it took me a while to figure out that it was something very basic, that at Shell we were telling stories of possible futures so that the company could adapt as best it could to a future that it could not predict or control. But that's not what the South Africans were doing. They were meeting not to adapt as best they could, but because they wanted to shift the future. And this idea that it would be possible for people from across a given system, in this case, the South African political economic system, including people that were sworn enemies who didn't agree with or like or trust each other, that it would be possible for such a group to work together creatively, joyfully, energetically, to try to change the system of which they were all a part. That was the inspiration, and that's what caused me to stop what I was doing, and that's that's the work I've been doing all day, every day since then, 31 years.
Yeah. It seems really simple when you say it. I mean, when you say you're trying to help a group of people, right, achieve some sort of steps, advance, a goal. People try to do that all the time in many different ways, and it doesn't always work, as you know, right?
Yeah. Well, I think you raised an important point right at the beginning, which is that this doesn't always work. So this is not a magic trick. It's what I saw in South Africa is it is possible. It doesn't mean it's easy or straightforward or guaranteed or irreversible, but it can be done. I remember almost nothing from physics at McGill, but I remember we spent a lot of time writing out what I think were called existence proofs. We would prove mathematically that a certain thing is possible. So this idea that this can be done, I've seen it with my own eyes many times. So that I think that's important, and I wouldn't want to be misunderstood of saying this is a recipe or something that always works. It's difficult to work with diverse others and to affect systems change. So often it doesn't work.
So I want to go to a specific example of this, an event, and you've referred to it quite often, your involvement with the war in Colombia. And, so I have to say, when I first heard that interview with you, I mean, I was struck by it, but at the same time, I was kind of skeptical because I'm not used to hearing people say, well, yes, we can collaborate with people, we don't like and we don't trust. We don't want to work with them. We don't even want to be in the same room with them. But you were saying it was possible. And in the case of Colombia, I mean, I understand, were able to bring together warring factions, right? You had leaders of guerrilla groups, you had political parties, you had military leaders, rebels. They were all coming to the same table. How is this possible? After decades, right, of mistrust, violence, bloodshed.
Yeah, so that's what happened in 1996, 97. Again, a series of workshops. The project was called Destino Colombia, Destiny Colombia. And yes, it was remarkable in that it brought together all of those actors, cabinet ministers, chief executive officers, guerrillas from both the FARC and the ELN, the two main left-wing guerrilla groups, and the paramilitary, right-wing paramilitary, all in the same room without a table, but that is an interesting detail.
Sorry, I was just thinking, back to what you said earlier, and I was wondering whether, in fact, they were at that point that you described earlier. They were at the point where they wanted change. They wanted something to be done. There was that was common among them.
Yes. Well, what was common among them is that none of them were confident that they could get what they wanted by acting unilaterally with their own friends and colleagues. So I wouldn't say they'd given up on that, because in fact the peace treaty was not signed until 20 years later, but they came because they had doubts about whether they could prevail unilaterally, and therefore were willing to come and talk. It wasn't super, there wasn't a lot at stake. It was come and talk about what could happen here. And it was set up in a way that was politically and militarily safe to be there, that it was a private meeting. It wasn't publicized until it was finished. The government agreed to give safe passage to the workshop of the armed actors, although they didn't trust that guarantee. And so the two guerrilla groups participated in 9 full days of meetings by speakerphone. This was before Zoom, but I realized it's an early successful case of a virtual meeting. And they found, like the South Africans, that over time, as they got to know each other and talked and and had meals together and late nights in the hotel bar together, talking and joking and singing, that they didn't necessarily agree with each other, but they understood each other better, and they could do something together. In that case, agree on what was possible in Colombia. There's two important codas to this story. The first coda is that a few years after this event, the member of the scenario team from the right-wing paramilitary had gone to see his boss in the jungle, and his boss said, "Hey, Ivan, we found the head of the Communist Party, Jaime Caicedo. We know where he is, and we're gonna assassinate him tonight." Caicedo had also been in the scenario team, and Duque, the paramilitary, said, "You can't assassinate him. We were in the Destiny Colombia scenario team together." And anyhow, of course, the story is more complicated than that, but I've always found that an amazing story, which I verified through several people, because I imagine what sort of commitment and relationship would you need to stand up to your boss, the head of the right-wing paramilitary, in a conversation in the jungle about an assassination? You'd have to feel pretty strongly about it to do that. So that's one coda.
If that is true, and you say it's been verified a few times, what was it that happened, do you think, at the conference, at these workshops, that would enable that kind of feeling between people who were sworn enemies? Because, you said, they spent time together, they had dinner together, they were singing together. Those things just don't happen. I mean, even the effort it took to bring them to the table, it doesn't just automatically happen. So, So what did you do, or what was facilitated in order to create an environment like that?
No, that's true. So, and that's important. So I didn't bring the people together. The organizers of the project brought the people together. These are Colombian political and economic leaders who thought this was something interesting to do. Actually, they had been advised by Nelson Mandela that this had been interesting in South Africa and maybe they should try it in Colombia. So they did. And it took them many months to bring the people together and to create the space, and I'm using that word deliberately, where something different could happen. It's a small hotel. It's remote. It's guarded so that people are physically safe. There aren't tables. That's why I was smiling when you said around the table. There's chairs, and they're working on flip charts to literally construct something together. That's the building something together. And in a space, and I think this is the direct answer to your question, in a space where they could connect as fellow human beings. It always interests me that of all the things we do in these workshops, the thing people like the best and always ask to be repeated is the simplest. It's called paired walk. So say we're going to go to lunch now. Before we go, could you look around the room, find somebody the most different from you who you never thought you'd talk to, and go for a walk with them? And we do this all the time. Are you saying
this is a person who could be your enemy, right?
Yes.
This is a person who, outside of that conference room, they could be your enemy.
Yes, and frequently, because it's set up, look around the room, find the person most different from you, go for a walk with them. It gives them permission to say, hey, Jaime, ha, 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 why don't we go for a walk together? And frequently it is sworn enemies who do. And it always interested me that this was the thing people liked most. They always say, can we do the walk again? That was much better than all this workshop stuff with the flip charts. So I thought
Adam,
a lot about this.
This almost sounds childlike.
Well, it
I almost sounds like, hey,
but it's a simple thing.
It's so basic. It's so basic, though.
And so what is it? At first I thought it was, well, we're walking together. We're not looking at our phones. We're not looking at our papers. We're facing in the same direction. We're moving through the world together. We're encountering a fork in the road or a log or whatever, and we're talking. And that's part of it. But I think there's something more fundamental. One of my a woman named Lucila Cerviche in Mexico. I was talking with her about this because she'd experienced it. She said, Adam, that's not the fundamental thing. The fundamental thing about the paired walk is first we're meeting as fellow human beings. And then secondly, maybe we'll change our thinking or our relationship or our action. She said, it's the opposite of the traditional Catholic confessional, where first you admit you're wrong and then you're readmitted to the communion. And so that's a long way of answering your question. What was it that went on between Iván Duque and Jaime Caicedo? I think it's simply that that the paramilitary Duque, sorry, it's confusing because the former president of Colombia has the same name, but I'm speaking about another Iván Duque. That Duque, I assume, stood up for Caicedo and had the assassination called off. Sorry, I forgot to say that was the end of the assassination was aborted. Stood up for Caicedo and had the assassination called off because he saw him, I don't know, as a friend, but certainly as a legitimate human being that had a right to be alive. I mean, that's the straightforward interpretation of he wasn't his friend, he wasn't his ally. He didn't agree with him about anything, but he thought he didn't deserve to be snuffed out as was proposed.
And I think too, you said this was one of the most common actions that people wanted, right? That they asked for. Didn't it also happen? Wasn't there a memorable walk in the Guatemala situation as well?
Yes. So,
where there were two opposing people who went for a walk.
Well, there's many of these stories of these most basic things, walks or storytelling or meals, or because it is, and I think this is maybe the basic point, the key to being able to work together amidst difference, amidst disagreement, diversity, discord, is, as Lucila said, to recognize that this person who I think of as the other is, a human being that's trying to do their thing, and I might not agree with them or support them, but I recognize that they have the right to also to be trying to live and to meet their aspirations. And somebody said to me once in Peru, I realize that this man's dreams are not my dreams, but neither are they my nightmares. But let me, I said there were two codas to the Colombia story, and the other one I'd like to tell you because for me it's of even wider applicability. The Destiny Colombia workshops took place in 1996, and if we fast forward 20 years later, 2016, the man who initiated the work in Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, who had been advised by Mandela that this might be something interesting to try, was now the president of Colombia and was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in October 2016 for the signing the peace treaty with the larger of the guerrilla movements, the FARC. And on the day that he was awarded the Peace Prize, his office, the presidency of Colombia, put out a statement saying, among other things, that the Destiny Colombia workshops had been an important step on the road to peace. So, of course, I was thrilled and immediately retweeted this vigorously. But actually, I didn't understand why Santos had said that. I didn't understand why would he remember on the day he gets the Nobel Peace Prize workshop from 20 years before that, in fact, he didn't even attend. He helped organize it, but realized that he was too.
But weren't they considered a success, and weren't they considered quite astonishing that you were able to get so many different factions together?
Well, they were considered a success, and they became very well known. And Santos was one of the initiators. Anyway, I didn't understand why he was emphasizing it. So many other bigger things that happened. billions of dollars of U.S. military aid. Santos himself had been Minister of Defense and had tried to crush the guerrillas. 5 years of negotiations in Havana. Why was he referring to these workshops 20 years earlier? And I went to Bogota a few months later and I conducted a public interview of Santos. And this was the first question I asked him. Why do you keep referring to Destiny Colombia? He used to mention it once a month in one speech or another. And he gave a very interesting answer. And this, for me, I'm deliberately saying something that I think is of much wider applicability than just dealing with civil wars in Colombia. He said, the reason I so often mention Destiny Colombia is that that's where I learned that, contrary to all of my cultural and political upbringing, he comes from a political family, it is possible to work with people you do not agree with and will never agree with. And this is very interesting to me because we're used to thinking, well, you know, we're going to have a workshop, we're going to have a meal, we're going to have a walk, we're going to have a drink together, we're going to find it was all a terrible misunderstanding and actually we want the same thing. But Santos was saying something that I think is of much broader applicability. He says, no, we may find that we don't agree and will never agree, and yet we have to find a way to live together. It's interesting. In English, the word for this in the peace, the common word used for this phenomena is coexistence. But in Spanish, there's a slightly different word used. It's convivencia. And convivencia means living together like a couple lives together. It has that connotation, like living with your partner. And for me, that's very evocative because for those of us who live with somebody else, I've been married 30 years to the woman I met in South Africa, Dorothy, you realize that it doesn't mean you're going to agree. It means you're going to find a way to live together, notwithstanding disagreements. Differences,
absolutely,
diversity.
Yeah.
So for me, this was not obvious to me at all, and has huge implications for facilitation. That facilitation or moving forward together is not primarily about agreeing. It's about moving. It's about doing things, notwithstanding that we might agree on some things and disagree on others. You know, there's a famous marriage researcher named John Gottman who's been doing empirical studies.
I've read his work.
Yeah, he's been doing empirical studies of marriage for decades. And he says, it's amazingly exact, he says 67% of marital disagreements are about irresolvable issues. And the difference between successful and unsuccessful marriages is successful marriages have a way of living with these permanent disagreements one way or another. So that for me, and this is so important because people think that facilitation is about, we're going to agree on all this stuff. And then once we've agreed it, we're going to do something. And that's
right. Yeah.
That's not a helpful or realistic way of thinking about it.
I want to go back to look at sort of the how to, the how you did it. And if we were to go back to, again, the Colombia situation and Destiny Colombia bringing all those, different groups together, one of the things I was really interested in that you wrote about, you talked about using it's sort of people's minds being open to inquiry in addition to advocacy. And I love the way you put that, so often I think when we go in and we have this agenda, we're advocates, right, for whatever idea we have, and we're going to push it and we want to make sure that that's what comes through. But you were saying that you have to be open to inquiry as well. So can you explain that? Because I think that seems to be fundamental to this process.
The fundamental idea, or one of the fundamental ideas of transformative facilitation, is you're dealing with polarities. You're dealing with two things that are both important where you can't choose one. So the overall polarity is between unity and plurality. So breathing in and breathing out. You can't choose only one. You have to do both. not at the same time, but alternately as the need arises. So that's the larger polarity. And then there's 5 specific polarities under that. And the first one of the 5 is the one you've alluded to, which is the most basic thing when we're trying to do anything in a group is the question, what's going on here? What's happening? If you're not able to talk about what's happening, then there's nothing you can do without some conversation or shared language about what's happening. And in that, the polarity within that is between advocating and inquiring. Advocating is, I think this is happening. This is my understanding. And inquiring is, well, how do you think about this? How does it look from your perspective? And the challenge is that very often everybody starts in advocating mode, and they start with saying the truth is this or that. And I had a colleague in South Africa who taught me that, who used to say, when you're pounding the table saying the truth is, just put at the beginning of the sentence, in my opinion. And if that's not enough, try in my humble opinion. And it's a joke, but it's a very nice joke because it says just that little bit of distance between you and your idea. I do have a view of this. I'm telling you right now, in this conversation, I have a view of lots of things. And I recognize it's not the truth. It's my understanding, my view, my experience. And by saying, in my opinion, I'm creating a little bit of space where you can question it or disagree with it, and I can have a bit of distance to it, and maybe at the end of the conversation I'll still think the same thing, but maybe I will have shifted my understanding. And that action of moving from the truth is to in my experience is the act of suspending. It's like I'm taking my idea and putting it on a string in front of me, and you can inquire about it. I can inquire about it. Maybe we'll agree, maybe we won't. But I'll have escaped from this idea that my opinion is the way things are.
And so what if though? I mean, these people are going back and forth between inquiry and advocacy, and you're facilitating this discussion. What if in the end they just can't agree and move forward? So not only can they not agree, but they just can't get beyond that, and they can't move forward. I think I actually read an example in your book. It was a case when this happened. I think it was in the Netherlands. Yeah. And it was interesting, yes, because it was a food lab, and you were saying that people didn't agree, but it was okay. They weren't ready to agree, and they still moved forward, which is a really kind of unusual way, I think, to operate.
That's why I wanted to tell you the Santos story, because that's that principle that it is possible to work with people you do not agree with and may never agree with. And yes, that was an important case. Yes, it was a group in the Netherlands working on sustainable food supply chains. And somebody said at the first workshop made a very straightforward suggestion that let's before we go further, let's agree on our definition of sustainability. And
which makes sense. It sounds like that makes sense.
It made sense to me. But I had this intuition that if we tried to do it, we'd get stuck. And so we didn't try to do it. And that particular group came back to that actually some years later. But the point is that even though they didn't have a precise agreed definition, that doesn't mean that they couldn't agree on, let's try this thing about shrimp processing or soy standards. And somebody once described this to me as a very Cartesian approach, this idea that we have to figure it all out before we can do anything. And that's really a terrible recipe in collaboration across difference for several reasons. First of all, we probably won't agree no matter how much time we spend. And secondly, we actually don't know what the truth is or what's going to work until we try it. So can we just do stuff, maybe not all together, maybe separately, and then see, and then bring it back and say, well, I tried this thing we talked about last time and it worked or it didn't work, or I learned this or I learned that. Now what? What's next? It's a more realistic and more manageable way of progressing than the idea we have to agree the problem, the definition, the solution, the plan before we can do anything.
And how do you know when it's working? Or I should say, how do you know when it's worked? So, I don't know how long these facilitative processes can take, or whether you get a sense at some point that, yes, we're making progress, we need to keep moving and we need to keep doing this, or this really is not going anywhere. Like how do you know?
Difficult. So first of all, it's not whether I think it's working, but whether the participants think it's working. And I guess the most straightforward answer is, do they think they're making progress on addressing the situation they came together to address enough that they're willing to continue working together rather than quit? That's what matters as far as I'm concerned. So the question isn't, did we sort this all out in this meeting we just had? And if not, then let's forget it. I mean, people might say that, or they might say, well, no, we didn't sort it all out, but we sorted a bit of it out and we know what to do next and it's worth trying. And, I've been working with a group in Mexico on illegality, insecurity, and inequity since 2014. So that's 8 years now? 8 years now.
Yeah.
Have they sorted out illegality, insecurity, and inequity in Mexico? No. Do they are they finding that it's useful and more useful to work together than not to work together? Yes. So I keep coming back to pragmatic answers. Are we making progress enough to be worth the effort? Now, here's where it gets more difficult. My colleagues and I have been working a lot on climate change. And climate is unusual in that there's a ticking clock. And that it makes a big difference, a huge difference, whether we can get to net zero by 2025 or 2030 or 2050 or 2080. And the idea that as long as we're making progress, that's good enough is not true in climate change, or not good enough. So the more difficult question that I'm working on a lot this year and trying to make progress on is, what is a way of collaborating across difference that is fast enough to address the crisis, or more, to elaborate a little bit, that has the speed and scale and justice that is required by the climate crisis.
And also with Colombia, I mean, yes, it took 20 years to get to that peace accord. But even so, I mean, how do you measure success? How do you measure Colombia's success? I mean, in those 6 years, there has been terrible violence, murders, hundreds of people have been killed, leaders. So how do you view that? How do you measure success there?
Yes, terrible things continue to happen in Colombia. There remains an unresolved civil conflict with the other guerrilla group, the ELN. Lots of fragmentation and polarization, and at the same time, a peaceful election for the first time ever, a left-wing president, Gustavo Petro, attempting to do new things with a combination of fighting and dialoguing. The answer I would give in general is I measure success by, does this social system, whether it's a country or a city or a nation, does this social system have an increased capacity to resolve to deal with its issues collaboratively rather than by force or violence?
I'm just wondering whether you've also thought that maybe the process of transformative facilitation has no end. And I mean, you talked about a marriage earlier, and that is, the majority of, I guess, issues we face in a marriage are unresolvable. And yet good marriages continue despite those unresolvable issues. Well, if you look at that in other parts of life, whether it is Colombia or within organizations or climate change, those things continue. And yet you have this transformative facilitation process that ends. Should it not continue? Shouldn't Colombia still be encouraging that, meeting with opposition? And that has no end. That always has to continue.
Yes.
This is hard work, right? And the hard work never ends.
Yes, that's correct. And I was just in Colombia 2 weeks ago, and there are people trying to use these approaches to deal with. We dealt with that set of issues. Now, what about the next set of issues? Mm-hmm. And there'll always be things coming up. But so it's not that a particular process has to continue, but yes, that's what I meant when I said I judge success by whether the people involved have a greater capacity to work things out peacefully rather than violently. For me, failure is, I just can't work with you, so I'm just going to force it to be the way I want it to be, and if I have to rub you out, so be it. That's failure. So success is, what's the joke I had heard on my very first trip to South Africa? The joke was, somebody said to me, faced with our unbelievably difficult challenges, we have two options. We have a practical option and a miraculous option. The practical option is we get down on our knees and pray for a band of angels to come down and solve this for us. The miraculous option is we continue to meet and talk and argue and find a way forward together.
That's good.
And so I'm interested in the miraculous option, but this idea that no, if somebody else would just solve this for us, a new prime minister, a new CEO, a new teacher, that they would just sort this out for us. And I think the alternative is developing this capacity to collaborate. And facilitation, as I'm using the word, just means helping people collaborate to transform the situation they're in.
I mean, given the divisiveness that we see in the world today, and just the political, economic, social divides we have, I mean, would you like to see this approach? Obviously, you would like to see it being used more since you have a vested interest in it, but can you see this approach working well with some of the big issues that we are facing, specifically today?
Yes, I wouldn't say yes, I have a vested interest, but that's not why I'm saying what I'm saying. I've written 5 books, but I've only had one idea, and it's this idea, which I think is valuable. This idea that it is possible to work together across deep differences, that it's not only possible, but it's increasingly necessary, and it is possible. And that doesn't mean it'll be easy or straightforward or guaranteed or calm. For me, the test in Canada, where we're both speaking from, is what is our capacity to do this as a society on the normal range of difficult issues that we are dealing with and will be dealing with forever. Maybe not the same ones, but there will always be things to deal with. And do we have the capacity to deal with this collaboratively rather than violently? That's what I'm interested in.
Well, I really enjoyed this conversation, Adam, and wish you all the best with your work. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Mary.
Adam Kahane is a facilitator and director of Rios Partners in Montreal. He's also the author of a number of books, including Collaborating with the Enemy and his most recent, Facilitating Breakthrough, How to Remove Obstacles, Bridge Differences, and Move Forward Together. For more on Adam's work, please check out our show notes. That is it for this edition of the CRAM podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Our thanks to the Temerty Foundation for their generous support. You might also be interested in our literary podcast called Passage to Wonderland. I highlight compelling passages from books that offer discovery, insight, and a sense of completion for the end of your day. You'll find Passage to Wonderland wherever you get your CRAM podcast. Thanks very much for joining us. See you next time.